But there's a school of economics, and I talked about this in chapter 5 of my book. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, MMT for short. Everyday viewers, everyday people to know anything about it, but more to the point, economists don't know anything about it. This is a new school of economics, if you want to think of it that way. So there is this modern monetary theory, but the leading scholar of modern monetary theory is a lady named Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor at the State University of New York. But she's the financial advisor to Bernie Sanders. What modern monetary theory says is that actually there's no limit on the amount you can spend. You can spend as much as you want, and the market will either buy the debt, or if they balk, the Fed will monetize the debt. So how much debt is there relative to the size of the economy? This is called the debt to GDP ratio, but the way it's a simple fraction you learn in the 5th grade. How much debt divided by the size of the economy? So in a simple example, if you had $5 trillion of debt and a $10 trillion economy, that fraction would be 1/2. So you would say the debt to GDP ratio is 1/2 or 50%. Today, the debt is larger than the economy. That ratio is over 100%. We have round numbers, about $23 trillion of debt and about a $22 trillion economy. So the ratio is about 105%, highest since World War II. That troubles me, it troubles other economists. But my friend Stephanie says, what's the problem? You could take it to 150%, 200%, 250%. By the way, that's where Japan is. Japan's at 250%. Greece is 175% or so. Italy's 135%. They're all still standing. Go to the Ginza, it looks like Times Square. So you don't see visible signs of stress. And here's the irony. Ben Bernanke would absolutely not agree with this theory, and he said so publicly. But Professor Kelton says to Bernanke, you proved our point. You were the one who took the Fed's balance sheet and quadrupled it from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion or so. You proved that you can print trillions of dollars of money without causing inflation, without causing high interest rates, without causing a run on the bank. So all we're saying is, you did it to prop up Jamie Dimon's bonus. We wanted to do it to forgive student loans. We may have different policy objectives, but the process is the same. What's the problem? Now, of all the things I've debated, for years I was dragged into Bitcoin versus gold debates, which I thought were silly. I mean, I don't like Bitcoin, I do like gold, but it's like fish versus bicycles. I mean, the debate never made sense to me, even though I did a lot of them. Of all the things I've had to rebut, this was actually the most difficult because it's superficially appealing. First of all, legally, it is true that the Fed can take their balance sheet as high as they want. There's no legal limit on the Fed's ability to print money. It is true that Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio, and they're still standing. It is true that the Treasury can borrow as much as they want, subject to periodic increases in the debt ceiling, which have never been denied. And the Fed can monetize the debt. So all the elements of the thesis are actually correct. So how do you refute it? And the answer is that legally it can be done. And if your goal is to print a lot of money and forgive student loans or give a guaranteed job or guaranteed basic income, whatever it is, in theory you could do that. But there is an invisible psychological boundary, and this is what the modern monetary theorists don't understand, and I don't think Ben Bernanke understands it. There comes a time when people wake up and they say, I don't know what's going on here, I don't have a PhD, but get me out of the dollar. I'll buy gold, I'll buy silver, land, oil, natural resources, buy a new car, buy a house. Get me out of the dollar into something tangible, because I no longer trust the monetary authorities. I no longer trust the Congress. I can't believe that you're going to spend this much money without ceiling, without limit, without causing inflation. My inflationary expectations will go up. And the way to deal with that is to buy hard assets, starting with gold, but not exclusively gold. There are, as I say, land, real estate, natural resources. They're all good substitutes. At that point, interest rates will skyrocket. All of a sudden, the bond market will have difficulty selling it. The president of the Congress could take away some of the Fed's independence. All of these assumptions could come crashing down very quickly, very unexpectedly, and that's the problem with the theory. People hear the government say, the economy's fine, or, unemployment's near an all-time low, which actually statistically is true. And they kind of nod and go, yeah, it's all good. And then reality is the stuff that hits you in the head like a 2x4. The propaganda is positive. We can talk about that in a little more detail. The reality is harsh, and reality wins. There's a very good book on this by Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize winning economist at Yale University. I'm not a huge fan of your garden variety PhD economists, but there are some good ones out there, and he's one of them. He wrote a book about, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, called Narrative Economics. And he said, yeah, we got all the models and Phillips curve and wealth effect and various quantity theory of money, and some have a place, some are more valuable than others, but don't underestimate the power of a narrative. A narrative is a story. It's basically it's a fancy name for a story, but a story that persists, that grows. And interestingly, in epidemiology, of course, we've just come through a pandemic. There's a model called the SCIR model that stands for susceptible. Are you susceptible to a virus? E for exposed. Are you exposed to it? I, are you infected? Did you get it? And R, did you recover? The difference between I and R are people who died. But it's a model, and it's mathematically based, and it's empirically validated of how viruses spread exponentially. And you can also use it to forecast how a virus is going to go. Well, what Shiller did, he took that model, moved it over to economics, and took a narrative kind of like a virus, not in a negative sense, but just as something that spreads. And it can be very powerful, and then eventually may die out or reverse, but it can be powerful in the meantime. That much I knew, but what I learned from the book that I hadn't really thought about is that narratives don't have to be true. They can be true, and they can be very powerful, but a narrative can be false and still be powerful. If it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes the reality to some extent, even if it's based on false premises. He gives an example during the Great Depression. The Great Depression really was two technical recessions, but there was a period from 1929 to 1933, election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then there was another period from 1933 to 1937. The 37 and 1940 part we leave aside for this purpose. But during the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative, but it's the worst possible economic advice, because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending that kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Now, when FDR came along, was elected in 1933, became president in 1934, the psychology turned 180 degrees, and all of a sudden, the Democratic campaign song was "Happy Days Are Here Again," and FDR seemed to solve the banking crisis and so forth. And all of a sudden, it became okay to spend money. Well, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1934 to 1936, those were some of the strongest years ever for the stock market. And unemployment did come down a lot. Now, the problem is it came down from like 25% to 15%. Well, 15% is still, painfully high, but it was a big move in the right direction. So he describes how the narrative flipped from don't spend money, it's poor form, to, yeah, go spend money and help the economy. None of that is taught in business school. It's not taught in economics. It can be modeled using this epidemiology model, but it doesn't fit into any of the standard macroeconomic models, but it's powerful stuff. And so today what's going on is that the White House is trying to push a narrative, and they're failing badly. But they'll say, if you listen to the deliberations among White House officials, some of the stuff leaks to the press, and I know some of these people, it's like the economy's great, unemployment's really low. We've created all these jobs since the pandemic, but we're doing a really bad job of messaging. The point is, inside the White House, they're frustrated that the positive economic story is not getting out. The correct analysis is that there is no positive economic story. The economy is in terrible shape. The problem is not the messaging, it's the message. And this is why I say the propaganda from the White House that things are great is at odds with the reality, which is things are not great. Let me give you some specific data points, because as I say, I don't like to make statements like this without backing it up. Number one, the inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything was great until February 27th, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up. All right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, transitory, transitory. And then finally, I think Jay Powell was testifying before Congress. He said, it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. So it predates the war, number one. Number two, energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine, it's because the U.S. counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president, and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. And then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada. Then ended new leasing, oil and gas exploration leasing on federal lands, handicapped the fracking industry, took a number of other steps using environmental tools, climate alarm, government subsidies, et cetera, to basically, to the extent possible, shut down the U.S. energy industry as much as possible. Now, you can't shut down completely, of course, but everything happens at the margin. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really, from $40 to $120 in under a year, which is comparable to what happened in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. And then Biden wakes up and says, guess we need more oil. And he wants to reopen leasing. I said they shut it down. They did, but he wants to reopen it. He's begging Saudi Arabia to pump more. Saudi Arabia is kind of not returning his phone calls. He's begging Venezuela to pump more. Oh, great. The greatest pariah dictator in the Western Hemisphere, and we're begging him for oil. So why don't we drill our own oil? Because we were a net exporter up until 2021, and then Biden came in and we lost that edge and became a net importer, including recently buying oil from Russia. They curtailed that for political reasons, but that's kind of where we got to. So you wonder why the price of energy is going up. In other words, this damage was self-inflicted, but don't be misled by the headlines, because they're, again, this narrative, but they're not actually doing it. So the point being, the price increase and the inflation in the U.S. has very little to do with Putin, and everything to do with the U.S. handicapping its own energy industry, begging dictators for oil, and the influence of the climate alarmists. And by the way, that whole crowd want higher gas prices. They want gas to be $7, $8, $9 a gallon, because they expect that will accelerate the transfer to electric vehicles and make the electric vehicle more attractive relative to the internal combustion engine. Now, that's another fantasy. It won't happen. We don't have time to go through all the physics of it. Output of energy by weight, gasoline compared to batteries, and the pollution of batteries, and the fact that we don't have the charging stations. And even if we did, where's that electricity coming from? Oh, coal. It will never happen. But meanwhile, they're destroying the U.S. economy in pursuit of an ideological point that will never actually happen. Another example of propaganda versus reality. Narratives are powerful, but reality is more powerful. But the Fed has a hidden asset.
In a surprising revelation, Jim Rickards talks about the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. He unveiled a hidden asset, gold certificates dating back to 1934. These certificates were issued to compensate the Fed when the U.S. Treasury confiscated its gold, a move that is believed to have legal complexities under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The certificates, valued at the fixed rate of $42.22 per ounce on the Fed's balance sheet, were originally meant to represent the historical cost of the confiscated gold. However, the intriguing twist emerges when considering the potential revaluation of these gold certificates to reflect the current market price of gold, which hovers around $1,850 per ounce. If the certificates were marked to market, it could reveal a hidden asset on the Fed's books worth approximately $350 billion. This unexpected revelation adds an interesting dimension to the ongoing debates about the Fed's solvency and financial stability. The implications of such a revaluation extend beyond the immediate financial adjustments. It could revive discussions about the gold standard, a monetary system where a country's currency is directly tied to a specific quantity of gold. This potential move could be seen as acknowledging the true value of gold and its role in backing the country's currency. Jim Rickards speculates on how the gold price might react to such a revaluation, positing it as a significant event that could attract attention and prompt a surge in interest and investment in gold. Furthermore, the potential move could be perceived as the Fed indirectly reverting to a gold standard. With Jim Rickards estimating that a conservative 40% backing of M1 money supply would necessitate a gold price of around $15,000 per ounce. In essence, the idea of marking the gold certificates to market on the Fed's balance sheet is presented as a complex and potentially transformative event that could have far-reaching consequences, sparking debates about the role of gold in the modern monetary system and the potential impact on the economy.
If you go to the balance sheet, go to the asset side, the first line item, there's something called gold certificate. And what is that? Well, in 1934, the U.S. Treasury confiscated the Fed's gold. They had already taken the gold from U.S. citizens by that point, but they wanted it all. And so they took the Fed's gold, but under the but again, bear in mind the Fed's privately owned. So under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it is illegal, it's unconstitutional to seize property without paying just compensation. You can do it, but you got to pay the person. And then people get into all kinds of arguments about what it's actually worth. So what just compensation did the Treasury give to the Fed when they took the Fed's gold in 1934? The answer is they gave them a gold certificate. It can be, you can calculate it. In other words, you can say, well, what is the amount of gold by weight, not by dollar value, but by weight that is needed to back up that certificate given the historic cost? So the answer is about 8,000 tons. Guess how much gold the Treasury has? About 8,000 tons. I mean, one of the reasons I've hypothesized that the Treasury stopped selling gold in 1980 because they lost gold to trading partners between 1950 and 1970. They lost 11,000 tons. They went from 20 to 9, but they sold another 1,000 tons in the 1970s to suppress the price of gold, which failed because it always does. But by 1980, they had were down to 8,000 tons and they stopped. Why did the U.S. stop selling gold? We've never sold any significant amount of gold since. The answer is, in my view, is that they can't go below that because that's the amount of gold the Treasury needs to back up this gold certificate on the Fed's books. So, okay, just kind of put that into one side. That asset is valued on the Fed's balance sheet at $42.22 an ounce. The price of gold, look today, it was about $1,850 an ounce. Now, so, what's, as I say, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If we're going to mark the mortgages to market in a world where interest rates have gone up and the mortgages have gone down, it's only fair to mark the gold to market. And if you mark that gold to market at $1,850 an ounce versus $42, voila, you would find that the Fed has another approximately $350 billion of hidden assets. So that takes care of the solvency problem. So before we beat up the Fed on mark to market on mortgages, that's fine, but have a look at the gold and realize that they have a hidden asset, a shadow asset on their books that's worth in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
What do you think it would do to the gold price if they did revalue mark to market their gold holdings? Do you think that would create a lot of attention for gold and people would pile in, or do you think it would just be an accounting change that no one really notices?
I think it would be a very big deal. But it begs the question, if you're going to revalue it, to what level do you revalue it? So everyone said, well, the market's 1850, that's about where it is today. It goes up and down, but so revalue it at 1850. That could be highly deflationary. And the reason is in effect, you're putting yourself on a gold standard. You don't have to. That's why they won't do it. They don't want to touch it. But if you did, you would be saying, hey, gold's really worth 1850 and we have this much gold, et cetera. But at that point, analysts would sort of turn and say, well, okay, well, you're back to a kind of gold standard. What's the relationship between gold and money or currency or US dollars and others, the money supply? But what is the relationship between gold and money supply? What you would find is that at 1850, the gold relative to the money supply is about 2%. Whereas historic gold standards were run with somewhere between 20 and 40%. Bank of England in the 19th century managed a successful gold standard between the Congress of Vienna and World War I with about 20% gold. In the US, through most of the 20th century, at least the first half, ran a gold standard with about 40% backing. It was actually the law. The law until the late 1960s, I think 1968, was that the Fed money supply, base money, could not be more than 2.5 times the value of gold. Originally $20 an ounce, $20.67 an ounce, later $35 an ounce. But whatever that number was, times the amount of gold, that had to be 40% of the money supply, and the money supply could not be greater than that. And then they got rid of that in 1968 because of the war in Vietnam. But the point being, 20% has worked, 40% definitely works. The Austrians like to bang the table and insist on 100%, but maybe, but that's historically not been required. You just need enough gold to be able to give gold to people who want it when they want it. And if you're credible in that dimension, most people are content to hold the money. So as a hypothetical, you can say, well, okay, let's say we want a gold standard, and let's say that we want 40% backing of M1. M2 is a bigger number, or at least it can be. Let's just say, so 40% backing of M1, that's a conservative kind of gold standard, not extreme, but reasonable. What would given the amount of gold the United States has, what would the price of gold have to be in order to maintain that ratio? The answer is about $15,000 an ounce. And people say, well, Jim, you used to say $10,000 an ounce. Well, that's true because it was true at the time. But when you expand the money supply, the number goes up, right? Because the amount of gold is fixed. So yeah, it was 10,000 not that many years ago, and today it's 15,000. Well, if you say gold's worth 1,800, people are going to say, well, give me the gold. I'll take all the gold you got at that price. And then they're going to have to shut the gold window again, and that has its own problems. But in other words, it's not clear how it would work. I mean, there are a lot of ways it could work mechanically. It's not clear what the government would actually do. But my point is, if you try to mark gold to market on the Fed's balance sheet, you're opening Pandora's box. Because you would be getting a lot of people, bankers, analysts, Wall Streeters, investors, to sit up and take notice and say, well, hey, what is going on here? You're back in the gold business. Well, you got the price wrong because you can't back up your money supply at that level. And the truth is you can't. In the US, we have a $100 bill. That's our largest denomination. When I was a teenager, the U.S. had a $500 bill, and they were in circulation. You could get them. So they eliminated that in 1968. No more $500 bill, and from then on, the $100 bill was the largest denomination. But the difference between then and now is that 1968, $100 bill was worth $100. If you adjust for inflation, the $100 bill of 1968 is worth about $20 in purchasing power in today's money. So we're already at a point where our largest denomination is worth $20 in purchasing power, at least compared to the 60s, $100 nominally, but it's greatly shrunk. So we don't have much cash. By the way, if you want $1 million in $100 bills, it weighs exactly 22 pounds, and it fits in an attaché case, $1 million in $100 bills. People look at me funny. They go, Jim, how come you know that? Well, first of all, I do know that, but it's really just a math problem because one bill, whether it's a 1 or 100, but I'm using hundreds because it's the biggest, weighs a gram. So, it's basically 10 grams or 10 kilograms, 10 kilos, or 22.2 pounds. The point being, we're very far down the road to getting any cash anyway, but you can still do it. You can get your 22 pounds and have your $1 million in cash. So why are they so driven to eliminate cash? What's that got to do with central bank digital currency? Well, now we get into the purpose of the central bank digital currency. And the metaphor I've used is that if you want to slaughter pigs, you have to get all the pigs into a cattle chute and run them into the slaughterhouse and then slaughter them. You can't just let them, run around. You got to herd them up and get them into a cattle chute, or cows for that matter. And so if they want to slaughter savers and investors, they have to get you into a digital slaughterhouse. And that's what digital money is all about. If you can't have cash and you can only have the central bank digital currency, then everyone's got to have a digital account. And once they've got you in the system, of course, they know who you are because it's all digital, and they keep the ledger. Back to the ledger. What can they do? Well, they can impose negative interest rates. So you have $100,000 at 1% interest. You go away for a year, you come back, you should have $101,000. But with a negative interest rate of 1%, you go away, come back in a year, and you'd have $99,000. Well, cash is an easy way around that. At least you can bury it in your backyard, but at least you'd have the $100,000 in my example a year later. But with a digital account, they can actually take it out of your account. Number one. Number two, they can put a timestamp or an expiration date on your money and say, okay, here's your money. It's in your account. But if you don't spend 10% of it in the next 30 days, we're going to impose a 2% penalty. We're going to take it away, basically, if you don't spend it. Oh, what does that do? It kind of forces you to spend it. Is that a kind of stimulus? Maybe, I'm not sure. These things don't usually work out as the eggheads plan, but the idea would be if we don't have enough what Keynes called aggregate demand, we'll force people to go buy stuff by telling them if you don't spend it, you lose it, use it or lose it kind of thing. Okay. Withholding taxes. Now, again, in the United States, I think it's similar in Australia. If you have a job, quote unquote, your regular payday or whatever, they pay you, but they deduct the withholding tax at the source, and it's based on the rate. So maybe it's, 20%. So you make $1,000, they take out $200, and here's the $800 net to you. And then at the end of the year, they give you a statement, and you file your tax return, and you claim the withholding, and you reconcile your taxes. But that's not true for independent contractors, doctors, lawyers, professionals, writers, anyone who you earn a living, you work, right? But you don't have any withholding tax. But you still have the money still goes in your bank account. Well, now they can just impose the tax on your bank account. Say, well, we see your inflows here. You make a nice living. We're going to take 20% of that. Again, send your receipt, tax receipt, and file your tax return and sort it out at the end of the year. That would come as a shock to a lot of doctors and lawyers. So negative interest rates and withholding taxes are two things that are hard to impose if in a world of cash and non-central bank digital currencies, but they're easy in a world of no cash and central bank digital currencies. Well, it gets worse. This is the culmination, just kind of cut to the chase. This is the culmination of the total surveillance state. We already have facial recognition software, very good. It's like your face is like a fingerprint. Everyone's a little different. You say, well, that's okay. I'm going to put a mask on because COVID, and sunglasses, and pull a hat down to my forehead. You'll never see my face. You know what? They have gait recognition software, GAIT, meaning how you walk. Everybody walks differently. There was an old, was it the Monty Python thing, The Mystery of Silly Walks? Well, silly or not, everybody walks differently. And so they can actually digitally identify you just by the way you walk. And so your mask isn't going to help you. And with GPS, I have a bunch of what are called Faraday sacks. They're, some of them are nice, they're leather wallets, but they're basically lined with a certain metallic fibers that block radiation. So if you want to turn your cell phone off, put it in a Faraday sack, and by the way, do the same with your Easy Pass and any other things sending out radiation, which are ubiquitous. Maybe they can't follow you around, but most people don't do that, and they do. And so with your iPhone, they know where you are at all times. You may be looking at a map trying to find a good restaurant, but they're tracking you. So they already do that. But now they take it a step further. So you're at the point of purchase, you're buying a book. Let's say it's a book that criticizes Kevin Rudd, for example. He's your leading panda hugger down in Australia, or in the United States, criticizes Joe Biden or something, or, Ultra MAGA hamburger, whatever it is. Well, oh, gee, Ultra MAGA, you're an extremist, you're a radical, you're part of the insurrection. So now we're going to freeze your account or deny the purchase or put you on a watch list, or we just appropriated money to hire 87,000 armed IRS, Internal Revenue Service agents. Maybe we'll assign one to you because you bought the wrong book. So now we're into thought control. We're into basically subduing your political enemies because what if you give money to a certain political candidate? Again, perfectly legal stuff. Buy a book, make a donation, that's legal. But they don't like who you're doing it with. And they meaning the government, they're watching. They know what you're reading and by inference, what you're thinking, who you're giving money to, what causes you support, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't take much these days to have some kind of low IQ spokesperson at the White House label you as an extremist. So this is all government has ever wanted, was total control of the people. Makes Louis the 14th look like a very hands-off kind of guy.
But Jim, the government would never do these things. The tax office would never target a political group. They would never target a group of people because of donations to different causes. They would never target protesters in any way. They would never target someone who's doesn't want to get vaccinated in any way. None of these things would ever happen.
Well, I know you're being actually very serious, but I know that's more rhetorical. The fact is, not only will they happen, they have happened, they are happening. This is the world we live in. That's absolutely the case. And let me give some concrete examples because I don't put stuff like that out there without backing up. So in 2010, the IRS targeted what we call in the United States the Tea Party movement. This was the first midterm of President Obama's first term in office. Historically, a time when the president's party loses a lot of seats. It's not even Democrats versus Republicans. It's just a consistent pattern of first term president, first midterm election, they lose seats. Obama lost almost a record number of seats, something like 63 or 64 seats versus an historical average closer to 30. Because of people were upset about Obamacare, they were upset about the tax increases, the bailouts coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis favored the rich, hurt the poor. There was just a lot of people were having second thoughts about voting for Obama in the first place. So we had this Tea Party movement, and they just kicked butt in the 2010 election. Well, so these were springing up everywhere. This was a genuine grassroots movement. There was no nationwide top-down organization. Communities were like, hey, let's start our own branch of the Tea Party, et cetera. And because they qualified as nonprofit organizations, there's some rules around that, but you have to apply to the IRS, our Internal Revenue Service, for a designation and a number proving that you're a nonprofit organization. Well, the person in charge of those was slow rolling all the applications. They weren't getting approved. They were entitled to it. The IRS intervened to squash the formation of Tea Party movements from coast to coast for political reasons, plain and simple. Well, that was 12 years ago, and there was no central bank digital currency. Imagine how much more powerful that kind of corruption is today. I'm going to spend $50 billion to create 51% of the mining capacity in the world, and I'm going to steal all the Bitcoin in the world and take down the Western financial system. First of all, there's no such thing as cryptocurrency. There are 1,000 cryptocurrencies. In other words, you cannot speak generically about cryptocurrencies with these people. Jim Rickards hates cryptocurrencies. That's not true. I really, really dislike Bitcoin, and I'll tell you why. But there are cryptocurrencies out there that I think are very interesting and worth your consideration. I'm for it. I'm against it. Cryptocurrency means nothing. You have to talk about the specific currency. And I'm showing Bitcoin, Litecoin, Monero, and Ether. By the way, isn't it fascinating how the graphical representation of cryptocurrencies is always a gold or silver coin? Bitcoin's gold and Litecoin's silver, Monero is both, and Ether is gold. I mean, what are they trying to say? I think that psychologically what they're saying is, well, this is nothing, but if we pretend it's a gold coin, then someone will buy it. But I just find this a little bit of an aside. But no, it's the same thing is true with fiat currencies. You can't be like or dislike fiat currencies generically. Some people do because they just hate central banks. I understand that, but it's a big difference between a Venezuelan bolivar and a euro. Big difference between a Zimbabwe dollar and a U.S. dollar. So in other words, don't talk to me about cryptocurrencies. Tell me what specific one you want to talk about, and that's a more interesting conversation. I think it's really important because this field is so muddied. The conversation is so muddied. People not distinguishing between blockchain and currency, not distinguishing between different types of currencies, et cetera. I think we need to step back, take a deep breath, and be rigorous in our analysis and think about what we're actually talking about. There's no such thing as a blockchain. There are hundreds of blockchains. In other words, every currency, every token, every so-called smart contract, if you're using Ether, has a different blockchain. So there are at least hundreds, perhaps thousands of blockchains, new ones being created every day. So again, don't talk to me about blockchain. Tell me which specific blockchain you're talking about, because they're not all the same, and this is critical. The main difference, there are many differences in this blockchain technology, but the main difference is validation. Because remember, the whole idea of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the original Bitcoin and what Satoshi Nakamoto came up with is that we're going to have a trustless system. We're not going to trust banks. We're not going to trust clearinghouses. We're not going to trust exchanges. We're not going to trust central banks. We're not going to trust anybody. We're going to have a decentralized system that a community can validate, and we don't have to rely on anybody in particular. That was the original idea. So the question is, what's your method of validation? And that's what distinguishes one blockchain from the other. So I've listed 4 of them here, but there are others. Proof of work, that's what blockchain uses. And you know what the work is? You got to like factor these, 87-digit prime numbers into prime factors. It's a lot of computer crunching, completely clunky, completely inefficient, non-sustainable. I'll talk about that in a second. But that's Bitcoin. There's something else called proof of stake, meaning you actually, this is what Ether is based on. You demonstrate that you have a certain percentage of the processing power, so you step up based on your stake. There's proof of space. Space is storage space on a hard drive, so I get to vote on the blockchain. I get to vote on validating the blockchain because I've decided to devote a certain amount of my hard drive to that process. There's a new coin called Space Mint. And then there's the Byzantine Agreement, or Byzantine Agreement. There's a version of that called the Federated Byzantine Agreement, which I personally think is the best, much more robust to some of the problems we're talking about, and there are others. But the point is, don't talk about blockchain. Say, okay, what's your governance model? What's your validation model, et cetera? And then ask yourself, is that sustainable? Is that robust? Will that resist an attack? Are your cryptocurrencies going to be stolen? These are the questions you have to ask yourself, and there are no generic answers. So I cannot emphasize enough. Coin by coin. I hate to use the word coin, whatever, token by token, blockchain by blockchain. Be rigorous and ask yourself what's sustainable. Now, Bitcoin, Ripple, and Ether, and some of these other cryptocurrencies, not all of them, but the best known are going to fail. When I say fail, they're going to, Bitcoin might have a $200 value as a token for criminals. I think criminals and terrorists might find a use case at about $200 per Bitcoin, but they're basically not going to be anywhere near where they are today. Why do I say that? I don't want to make a claim without backing it up. The first point is they're non-scalable. Transaction times are slow, and then when you say that to Bitcoin people, they go, aha, the Lightning Network is right around the corner. Lightning's going to, we'll see. They said that about segregated witness. They said that about some of these other solutions. They don't seem to get community support. They keep forking the Bitcoin, meaning one day you wake up and there's 2 blockchains instead of 1, or whatever happened to that whole idea that we weren't going to have inflation and we weren't going to pull new cryptos out of thin air. But these solutions, you have to understand what the solution is. So what they're saying is nobody has a solution for the inherent slowness, clunkiness, non-scalability of the original Bitcoin blockchain. There's no solution for that. So when you hear about solutions, what are they? Well, what they're saying is take a bunch of transactions offline. So everybody in the room could form a group, or let's say every coffee shop in Brooklyn, New York, or every coffee shop in Vancouver could form a group. And all the people who want to buy coffee would join that group. And we would agree, so we're in our own little bubble over here, and we would agree that all of our Bitcoin transactions among each other don't go on the blockchain. They just get settled in this sort of separate cloud over here, and then we net them out. So, I pay you 5 Bitcoin, and you pay the person next to you 4, and he pays the lady in the back of the room 10, and she pays me 7, and we net it out, and then periodically, and it could be daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever, we net all this stuff out, and then we take that net and we put that on the blockchain, so that the amount of transactions that have to go on the blockchain is greatly reduced. That's true. But what are we doing? We've created our own network. I got to trust the coffee shops. How do I know they're not going to steal my money? In other words, it's only a solution because you're completely negating the original idea. Oh, sure. If you want to tear up the original idea and start over, that's fine. But don't tell me you're adhering to the idea of a decentralized, trustless network, because you're not. All you've done is create another network. Somebody, I get trolled on Twitter all the time. People tell me I'm an idiot and I don't know technology and all that stuff. And then my more sour moods, I tell them I was coding before they were born. But as far as some of these things are concerned, somebody said, well, you don't understand payment channels, and I actually do. And I said, yeah, I understand payment channels. We had those in the 50s. They were called party lines, which is, you pick up the phone and someone's talking, you got to ask them to get off the phone so you could go. In other words, there was an AT&T network, at least in the United States, but other people could jump in on this little side thing. That's all it is. These are party lines. So that doesn't work. Non-sustainable. The energy usage to solve the problem and make the proof of work in Bitcoin is now greater than the annual energy output of Ireland. Imagine taking all the electricity used in Ireland in a year, and that's how much we have to use to crunch numbers. By the way, every applied mathematician will tell you that prime factoring is a trivial problem. It's like an uninteresting problem. Yeah, inflation's coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message. Why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off, and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book, just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist, he's a lawyer, so he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won. because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981, 82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't. If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing. And that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up and, people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed. And energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side. But by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons. If you look at yield curves, look at the Treasury yield curve, Euro-dollar futures yield curve, German Bunds yield curve, they're all inverted. They're all inverted. Now, inversions happen, just meaning the longer term rate is lower than the short term rate. We're seeing something globally we've never seen before. And it is the best single indicator of a recession. The last time we saw anything like this was in 2007, just ahead of the 2008 financial catastrophe. So the stock market's saying it's all good, Goldilocks, soft landing, Fed's going to get the memo, they're going to cut rates, the pivot, and buy stocks. The bond market is saying no. This is bad, and it's going to get worse, and it's actually too late for the Fed to do anything about it. See, when these inversions start, sometimes they're a year forward, like, hey, look at the Euro-dollar futures yield curve a year from now, man, that thing is inverted. But what happens is, as you get closer to the actual thing you're worried about, the inversion gets nearer and nearer. Now it is literally a month away or less. So that's like a big red siren, flashing light, whatever you want to call it. Okay, whatever your baseline is, probably treasuries, 2-year notes or 5-year notes or whatever, they will come down a lot. Not right away. We may still be a month or two away on this, but they'll come down a lot. And then corporate yields will go up a lot because of the recession, because of deterioration, increased bankruptcies, reduced revenues, et cetera. So those spreads will blow out. And it's important to remember, interest rates are a lagging indicator. Everyone's like, well, how could interest rates be going up if we're in a recession? The answer is, as you get closer to recession, who figures it out first? Well, the Fed figures it out last. They're usually the last to know. Wall Street is second last to know. The people who figure it out first are actual business people, entrepreneurs, restaurant owners, dry cleaners, taxi drivers, or even medium-sized businesses. They see it. If you're in the trucking business, it's real time. If inventories are sky high and new orders are being slashed, you're not moving anything by truck. So there are certain businesses that are concurrent. The yield curves I was talking about are very good forward indicators. They tell you what's going to happen next. A lot of business people are living in the real world in real time. They know what's happening now, and the stock market tends to figure it out later. But as far as banking and credit is concerned, what happens is if you're a business person and you see business heading down, fewer customers, whatever, you go out and borrow all you can. You're like, hey, there's a really bad recession coming. If I got lines of credit, I'm going to use them up now. I don't want my bank changing the terms. I said, I'm going to borrow everything I can. And that creates a demand for funds and interest rates go up. And then the recession hits and the bankers go, what's going on? Credit losses start going up. And then they just turn off the spigots and they raise standards, they stop doing loans, and then interest rates will start to come down. Interest rates peak after the recession has already begun. So interest rates may not have peaked yet. Even the treasury market. So that's not unusual. Now, here's what the Fed is missing, or maybe everybody's missing. When you hear these layoff announcements, people are like, well, if they're laying off, why isn't the unemployment rate going up? Well, the answer is they have to announce the layoffs. There's all kinds of statute, SEC. So if I'm going to fire 10,000 people, I got to tell the world I'm firing 10,000 people. It doesn't mean I fire them that day. I might fire them on a rolling basis over the next 30 days. And it doesn't mean they walk out the door empty-handed and head for the unemployment office. I might give them 3 months severance, 6 months severance, et cetera. And so when do they actually show up to the unemployment office and say, give me a check? It might not be till this spring. So the layoff announcements are out there, but the unemployment rate hasn't budged because there is a lag, 3 months. But that's why I said interest rates lag the business cycle, and they do. Unemployment lags the business cycle. Unemployment is a lagging indicator. When you're an employer, entrepreneur, and you're in any kind of distress, not as many customers walking in the door, you'll do everything you can to avoid laying people off. You'll, be late on the rent. You'll turn down the lights, find a cheaper laundry, whatever it takes. By the time you get around to firing people, you run out of options. Like, oh, I've done everything I can. Now my business is in jeopardy. I have to fire some people. And then combine that with what I just said about severance and, rolling terminations, et cetera. It's a lagging indicator. But we know enough right now to know that number's going up. But that's not inconsistent with the fact that we're already in a recession. It's exactly what you would expect, that unemployment's a lagging indicator. So when the Fed's on a mission, they actually don't care about the stock market. Here's what they do care about. They care about disorderly markets. And that's the key word. It's not, if stocks are going down, but it's, kind of little, 0.5% a day, 1% a day, trending down, lower highs, lower lows, trending down. The Fed doesn't care about that. They're not going to bail out the stock market. They do care if it's disorderly. When was it disorderly? Well, March 2020, at the worst part of the pandemic, it dropped like 30% in like 2 or 3 weeks. The fall of 2008, it was like somebody opened a trap door. The Fed does care about that because that kind of disorderly behavior can feed on itself and end up in a 1929 type scenario. So the Fed will get the memo, as I put it, stop raising rates and begin cuts when the markets are disorderly. That may happen. In fact, I expect it will, but we're not there yet. So there may be a pivot, but not because of Goldilocks, but because it's not a soft landing, it's a crash landing. So the global economy is in bad shape. It's going into a recession. Now, a lot of people have said that, we're going to have a recession as if it's no big deal, but they're expecting a mild recession. I see a much more severe recession. Now, the other half, what does this mean for financial markets? And there, the best way I've been able to explain it, imagine you're in an Irish pub and you got 3 Irish storytellers. And I'm part Irish, so I can talk about the Irish, but they're telling 3 different stories, and you got to listen to each one. So there's the Fed story, the market story, and then there's something called reality, what's actually happening. So stock market's telling us Goldilocks, bond market's telling us, here comes, Hurricane Mitch or whatever. And then there's what I call the reality. And I guess I'm the storyteller here, but what I see is a kind of a hybrid. The Fed's doing what they're doing, right or wrong. Okay, they're doing what they're doing. The market has their own interpretation. I agree with the market, certainly the bond market, that the Fed has probably over-tightened, and they may pivot to say that there could be a rate cut. Maybe, I wouldn't rule that out, but for a really bad reason. In other words, if the Fed cuts rates, which they may, the pivot may be real. It's not because they engineered a soft landing and Goldilocks and everything. Oh, that's just right. It's because they screwed up as usual, as they've been doing since 1913. They over tightened and they found out too late. And then they have to slam on the brakes or take the foot off the brake, if you will, in terms of rate hikes, and then pivot. And we've seen this movie before. This is exactly what happened in 2018. The stock market dropped 20%. It's like 19.9 or something on the Dow, so maybe not technically a bear market, but yeah, what's the difference? It dropped 20%. The Fed was tightening into that collapse. The Fed tightened on December 16th, 2018, only like 8 days before the Christmas Eve massacre, and after most of the 20% collapse had already happened. They tightened one last time. So what it shows you is that when the Fed's on a mission, they actually don't care about the stock market, this whole, Bernanke put and Greenspan put and all that. That's not how it works. They don't care that much about the stock market level. A couple of things. Number one, I would increase my allocation to cash. I'll stick with cash, but let me kind of put that in a context. The most powerful investment tool we have is diversification. Problem is people don't understand what diversification means. So I run into people all the time. They say, well, I'm completely diversified. I own 50 different stocks in 10 different sectors, semiconductors, consumer non-durables, minerals, et cetera. And I say, you're not diversified. You may own 50 stocks in 10 sectors, but you have one asset class, stocks, which are subject to conditional correlation. In calm markets, they're idiosyncratic, but in panics, they all go down together, or in bubbles, they all go up together. So you're not diversified. So what is diversification? Diversification is having slices of asset classes that are minimally correlated. There's probably not zero, but as close to zero as you can get. So what would that be? You'd have a slice of gold, but I recommend 10%. I have some strong views on gold, and I've written a lot about it, but people are surprised to hear me say 10%. Like, oh, Jim, why isn't it 50% or 100% if you believe all this? Well, I do believe it. I wouldn't say it if I didn't, but you don't want to be 100% in anything. You don't want to be 50% in anything. 10% is fine. If I'm wrong, you won't get hurt. And if I'm right, you're going to make so much money that it'll actually kind of be the insurance on the rest of your portfolio. But that leaves 90%. So I would have a large slug in cash, maybe 30%. And people say, well, wait a second. Banks pay me 25 basis points. Stock market's going up. Why would I want to be in cash? That's horrible. A couple of things. Number one, the stock market might not always go up. Cash is the opposite of leverage. So leverage increases the volatility of the rest of the portfolio. You'll get much bigger returns, but you'll have much bigger losses. If you have a slice of cash and you've got a volatile asset over here, which are stocks, and other volatile asset over here, gold's fairly volatile. If you got that volatility and you have cash, it will reduce the overall volatility so you can sleep better at night. Cash is a great asset in deflation. And if you're talking about inflation, which is here, then you got to deal with that. But don't rule out deflation. If we go into a recession because the Fed over tightens, or, the thing about the inflation, just a quick aside, it comes in two flavors. There's cost push and demand pull. Demand pull is when individuals are worried about inflation and they start accelerating purchases. Like, hey, I better go buy that washing machine right now because the price is going up, or better go buy that house right now because the price is going up. That's demand pull. Cost push comes from the supply side, not the demand side. And that's what we're seeing because of what we talked about, supply chain, energy cost. The Fed can't drill for oil. Raising interest rates doesn't get you more oil or natural gas. So the Fed can't do anything about it except kill the economy. Yeah, and that'll cool it off. But when you pay, I put gas in my car. I don't just read about this stuff. It used to be $45. Now it's about $75. Multiply that by 200 million cars across America. What happens is it reduces your discretionary income. If you're paying another $30 at the pump twice a week, then you're not going to go out to dinner Friday night. You're not going to, take a vacation, whatever it may be. So that depresses all those other areas. So there is this recursive function. So don't rule out deflation down the road. Not right away, but maybe next year. So cash. But here's the biggest value of cash. It gives you optionality. People don't understand this. What if I said to you, "Hey, I'll sell you a call option, an at the market call option on every asset class in the world"? You go, "Gee, that sounds kind of valuable." Well, that's what cash is. When things are crashing, you're the one who can go shopping. And nobody's better at this than Warren Buffett. He's got his cash level at Berkshire Hathaway is at an all-time high. So there's a place for that. You can have some stocks, but I would look at the energy sector. I mean, I actually built and I own the largest non-commercial solar module field in New England. And I run my house off it. It produces about 7.5 kilowatt hours. So I know a little bit about it. And what I know is it doesn't work at night. It doesn't work in snow. It doesn't work in rain. It doesn't work in really cloudy days. By the way, you don't run your house off of solar modules. You run your house off of batteries.
Yeah.
And then the modules charge the battery. So you watch the battery level. That's how you manage it. So it works fine. But if you think you can run cities with that, forget it. So it's just not practical at that scale, even if you thought it was. And it isn't. That's very clear. But here comes wind turbines and solar. And I'm not against it. Like you say, I own one. But they're not scalable. They're intermittent. And they don't give you the base power, baseline power you need to run a modern power grid. Meanwhile, here's global demand. Okay, so the gap's getting bigger. It's not getting smaller. Renewables, whatever the pros and cons, are not closing the gap. The gap's getting bigger. There is no substitute for oil and natural gas and uranium. You got to put uranium in the mix. And hydro, if you live in Quebec, that's great. A lot of hydro, but not so much in the desert. And I've spoken to, without mentioning names, I would say you can go no higher in terms of who knows, let's just say board members of the 5 biggest oil companies in the world who said, yeah, as he said, we talk about that, but we can't say it publicly because we'll be, dragged, chained and dragged through the streets. But those are just the facts. So therefore, if you have an oil sector that's been bashed by the climate alarmists, but you can't do without it, which is true, buy some oil companies, when they're, so there's your stock portfolio. Private equity, venture, real estate, not commercial, but residential, yes. and farmland. That's one of the hottest asset categories, and gold. So that's diversification, and that's the kind of portfolio you want, the kind of season to taste. So the question is, will the Fed go down that path, do what they have to do the only thing they can do to subdue inflation at the cost of a very severe recession and something like a stock market crash? Or will they see that coming? They'll be the last to know. We'll all see it before they do, but they'll be the last to know. It's because they rely on flood models, and they're kind of in their own economic forecasting bubble, and they have very defective ways of thinking about the economy, and they're very much a creature of inertia. There are a whole lot of reasons why the Fed is not nimble. It's kind of quite the opposite. But they'll see it eventually, probably when it's too late. And will they balk at that point and stop rate hikes and maybe even reduce rates? That could save us from the recession, but that will just amplify the inflation. So rather than say which one's going to happen, I prefer to lay out those two paths and then just watch it very carefully. But more to the point, we've seen this movie before. This is a replay, and I think it's on, like you hit the remote control for double or triple speed. It's going to happen faster, but this is a replay of everything that happened from 2013 to 2019 and into 2020, which was, I'll just go through it quickly. So 2013, May, Bernanke says we're going to taper asset purchases. That's money printing, quantitative easing, whatever you want to call it. The market, tanks, bonds go down. Everyone's like, oh, it's over. Bernanke balked. But finally, in November 2013, they said, okay, the taper begins. They were still printing money, but at a slower rate, and that matters. That went on until late 2014. The taper was over. They stopped buying new assets. They said, okay, here come the interest rate hikes. Except they didn't come for another year. It wasn't until December 2015 that then Janet Yellen finally raised rates. And then another year for the second rate increase. So it was December 2016. So it was really, really slow. Took 2.5 years, but they got to 2 rate hikes. But then here comes Jay Powell, and then like clockwork, boom, 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 25 basis point hikes every meeting. And all the Fed was trying to do was to get back to normal. They were trying to get interest rates to maybe 2.25, 2.5, get the balance sheet down to, something like 2.5 trillion. They never specified it, but that would have been a reasonable level. So, okay, now interest rates are kind of normal, 2.5, balance sheet's down around 2.5 trillion. We're back to normal. We finally got through the global financial crisis of 2008. We undid all that stuff. Well, what happened? From October 1st, 2018 to December 24th, 2018, the stock market dropped 20%. That was the December 24th, 2018, we call it the Christmas Eve massacre. Stock market went down 3% in one day. But the Fed was tightening into the weakness, as they always do. And the last interest rate hike, it was December 16th or 17th, within a day or two, but mid-December 2018, they were still hiking and raising rates. And that was the last straw. And then the market just tanked. And then finally, Jay Powell got the message. First week of January 2019, he says, okay, that's it. We're going to be patient. Use the word patient. It's one of these code words. You have to get the code book out and see what it means. But patient means we won't raise rates again without giving you advance warning so you can get out of your carry trades or whatever. And then he went further, said, looks like we got to cut rates. And they did. And then by early 2020, here comes the pandemic. And then they took rates all the way back to zero. And then they started QE, I don't know, 6, 7, call it what you want. They took the balance sheet to $7.5 trillion after getting it down to $3.5 trillion. So look at that whole sequence from 2013 to early 2020, including the pandemic. What happened? They tapered the asset purchases. They raised rates. They sank the stock market. Then they said, okay, no more rate hikes. Then they cut rates, and then they started QE. And by April 2020, where were we? Zero rates, back down to zero, and the balance sheet was $7.5 trillion after getting down to about $3.5 trillion. So that was a big circle. They ended up back where they started from. But the point being, they failed to normalize. They failed to get rates where they wanted. They failed to get the balance sheet where they wanted. They did sink the stock market. Okay, now 2 years forward, here we are again. What are we doing? They just raised rates at the March meeting. They're going to raise them again in May. And that's the easiest forecast I've ever made. 50 basis points, May 4th. Boom. You can count on it. And they're going to announce. By the way, I don't have a crystal ball. The Fed told us this. I mean, that's the thing about the Fed. They may be wrong, but they're transparently wrong. So they tell you what mistakes they're going to make in advance. So that's the Fed forecasting is actually
fairly straightforward because you just have to believe them. So they're going to raise rates again in May, probably 50 basis points. They're going to announce a reduction in the balance sheet. Whether they actually start it in May, they probably will. 100 billion a month reduction in asset purchases. So that's QT, quantitative tightening. In other words, they're running the same playbook they tried to run, or they started to run in 2013, 2014. They failed the last time. Why do they think they're going to be any more successful this time? Why do they think they can get out of this? And the answer is, pardon me, the answer is they cannot without a recession. They can normalize rates in the balance sheet and they can stop inflation, but not without causing recession and not without causing a stock market crash. So the big question for the next year is, will the Fed do that? And they may. Or will they balk again, at which point you might rescue the market, but the inflation is just going to go wild. That's the debate. But the thing is about framing it that way. You've got two paths, and we'll get signals along the way. We won't be the last to know. The Fed will, but we won't. You'll be able to see this coming.
China doesn't have any of that. None of it. There's no significant Chinese bond market. They don't have the infrastructure of banks and dealers I described. They don't have the physical infrastructure. And most of all, they don't have a rule of law. You can't trust the Chinese as far as you can throw them. I was a facilitator and then a participant in the first ever financial war game ever conducted by the Pentagon. We did this at a top secret location called the Warfare Analysis Laboratory. One of the things we did there, I was on the China team. I wanted to make it realistic. So I said, let's lie, cheat, and steal, because that's what Wall Street does. And that's a more realistic game. So I recruited a friend of mine who's fluent in Russian to be on the Russian team. And I had dinner with him before we went down to the laboratory. And I said, look, here's the plan. I'm going to persuade my China team colleagues to basically announce a new gold standard. And we've accumulated enough gold, and we're going to say, for now on, our currency is backed by gold. We're going to put the gold in Switzerland to keep everybody happy. We're going to issue notes from a bank created in London under English laws to keep everybody happy. Here's the thing. We're going to say, from now on, if you want our exports, you have to pay for us in this new currency. We're not taking dollars anymore. And furthermore, and if you want some of this new currency, you can deposit your gold in Switzerland and the bank will issue you some currency, so you're in the system. Or you can trade with us and run a surplus, and then we'll pay you in the currency and you can use that to buy our stuff, or we'll give you loans. But one way or another, we're done with the dollar. And obviously this is very forward leaning, but the whole idea of a war game is to help the Pentagon think 5 or 10 years ahead. So the first thing that happened when you go to your embassy or conclave, you come out and you stand up at the podium, you announce your plans, and then everybody reacts and it's discussed, et cetera. The first thing that happened is there was a group. So we have the red team, the yellow team, the blue team, as the case may be, and they're all different countries or areas. But there's a white team, which are the referees. They decide what you did. And the first thing they did when we announced the gold move, they ruled it as an illegal move. They said, no, that's not in any of our scenarios. You can't do that. And I stood up, and about 100 people in the room. There are 3-star generals, CIA, FBI. I said, wait a minute. I said, this is a war. There are no illegal moves in a war. The whole idea is to be out of the box or live in a world where there are no boxes. That's what we're doing here. So they agreed. They said, okay, we think it's a really dumb idea, but we'll let you do it. Well, over the course of 2 days, it accelerated and gathered momentum. At the end of it, Russia got PowerPoints. Okay, so this was 2009. Within 10 years, so what facts happened? Within 10 years, Russia tripled its gold reserves. Last week, the dollar value of Russia's gold exceeded the dollar value of its treasury securities. They have 20% of their reserves in gold, and the value of their gold is more than the value of the U.S. treasury securities. They're dumping treasuries, buying gold. Exactly what we warned the Pentagon about 10 years ago. And here it is, and China has more than tripled its reserves. So we're not there yet, but we're moving to some kind of gold-backed world. But the point is, that was all in the war game. That's all in the book. And I made one other point. I said, currency wars don't happen all the time. They might only happen twice in a century. But when they happen, they can last for 10 or 15 years. That's how long it takes to sort out. What you describe about the Chinese money supply is absolutely correct. People in the United States complain, oh, the Federal Reserve has printed $4 trillion in the past year. And they have printed $4 trillion in the last year. They've taken the Fed balance sheet from about 3.5 trillion to 7.5 trillion. So yeah, we printed $4 trillion in the past year. Didn't do any good, won't do any good, but we did it. But Chinese money supply is even larger and growing faster. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds on China's internal monetary policy. I could, except to say that they're grossly over leveraged. The economy is investment driven, not consumption driven. They're about 40%, 45% investment. The US is about 25% investment. So that gives you some idea of how investment is to the Chinese, which is actually okay if you're investing in productive assets that pay the way. They're not. They're wasting the money. I've been to China many times, been going back and forth there for 35 years. I've been out in the countryside. I don't just stick to the hotel lobby in Beijing. I got mud on my boots visiting these ghost cities. And so each ghost city, there are a bunch of them, actually seven. Imagine building 7 cities. That's what I saw. And so they got 1 or 2 skyscrapers, and they got mixed use, and they got retail shopping, a country club, a hotel, a golf course, a pond, highway stops, airport, etc. And it's all empty. I mean, it's just all empty. Shiny new construction, some of it still under construction, all empty. So I said to the communists, I said, what are you guys doing here? I mean, nobody's here. So, oh, don't worry. People will be coming from the countryside. They will be populating these cities. And I said, when? I said, no one's coming. And besides that, you've already drained the countryside. That already happened. But I said, you cannot mothball a building. It's not like some old clothes. I mean, the way a building maintains itself, it gets occupied and there's maintenance and people fix it and all that. I visited, I used to travel a lot in Central Africa in the early 80s. It was Zaire at the time. Today it's the Congo. I was in Kinshasa, but it was right after the 70s commodities boom. And they took the money, of course they wasted it, and they built these skyscrapers in Kinshasa, which is like a swampy, scary, funky, city. But there's a skyscraper, but the windows are falling out and there were rust stains running down the side and the elevators were broken. So it might have looked nice the day they built it, but it was never really used. And now it was literally, when I was there, it wasn't that much later after they built it, it was falling apart. So that's going to happen in China. My point being, if you apply, generally accepted accounting principles to their investment account, you would write it off the day they open the building because nobody's there. It's not worth anything. So they're wasting the money. They're over leveraged. They're overprinted. However, none of that has anything to do with the status of the Chinese yuan as a global reserve currency. The yuan is not a reserve currency. It will not be probably in my lifetime, maybe never. And I'll tell you why. Because a lot of people don't understand what a reserve currency really is. You get a report from the IMF and it says, 60% of global reserves are in dollars, which is true, and about 25% are in euros, which is true. So 85% of global reserves are in dollars or euro, which means the only meaningful exchange rate in the world is the euro-US dollar cross rate. Everything else is working around the edges. You got some sterling and yen and Swiss francs and a couple other things. Aussie dollar is tiny, believe it or not, good currency, but not a big part of it. And China's like this kind of invisible 1% sliced down at the bottom. And China has $1.4 trillion in its reserves. But here's the point. It's not as if they have pallets of $100 bills stacked up in the basement of the People's Bank of China. They don't. You invest in securities. In other words, they're dollar-denominated securities. So it's not actually dollars. They're treasury bills, notes, and bonds denominated in dollars. So the thing that makes a reserve currency is not the currency, it's the bond market. You need something to invest in. Again, so you need a liquid bond market with different maturities, different interest rates. You need dealers, you need auctions, you need payment and clearance systems, you need repo or repurchase agreements, futures, options, when issued trading, custodians, the rule of law. There's a whole massive infrastructure, which we started working on when Alexander Hamilton was, advising George Washington, and we've been doing it ever since. And others, Bank of England has done the same. China doesn't have any of that. None of it. There's no significant Chinese bond market. They don't have the infrastructure of banks and dealers I described. They don't have the physical infrastructure. And most of all, they don't have a rule of law. You can't trust the Chinese as far as you can throw them. And so they have no chance of being a global reserve currency, none. Same with the Russian ruble, same with a lot of other currencies, same with Bitcoin. Show me the Bitcoin bond market. Maybe you can get my attention, but not sooner. So none of those are going to replace the dollar. First thing, my wife hates me to admit this, but I was once a registered lobbyist in Washington. I ran an office there. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. And the first thing I learned in Washington is you can't beat something with nothing. In other words, if you hate a policy or a program, you just hate it, you write op-eds, fine. You're not going to change it unless you bring something to replace it. So for all the criticisms of the dollar, and there are plenty of them, you're not going to dethrone the dollar as the leading global reserve currency unless you can show me what you're going to replace it with. And there's one and only one contender in the world today, which is gold. So that's a whole other conversation. I'm not saying we're going to be on a gold standard tomorrow. As far as China's concerned, yeah, China's a house of cards. It's going to collapse. It's going to be ugly. Hard to say when, but probably sooner than later. And they know it. And they're not going to be a global reserve currency. So we can put China to one side, but yeah, China's a house of cards. Now, getting it back to the United States, the first point, let's talk about stimulus first. So yeah, the Fed printed $4 trillion. Congress, we had $1 trillion